In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Within weeks, Europe suddenly faced a crisis it had spent decades ignoring. It had built its entire energy economy around Russian natural gas, pipelines running thousands of kilometers, supply agreements signed for decades, entire industries, chemicals, fertilizers, steel, glass, designed to run on cheap Russian gas. When that gas stopped flowing, European governments scrambled for alternatives. They called Qatar, they called the United States, they called Australia, Nigeria, and Algeria. Every one of those conversations led to the same piece of infrastructure, an LNG terminal. Before 2022, most people outside the energy industry had never heard of an LNG terminal. After 2022, governments were approving them in months rather than years. Germany, which had never built a single one, commissioned 5 floating LNG import terminals in under 12 months. Because the countries that control LNG terminals control something more valuable than oil wells or gas fields. They control the ability to redirect energy anywhere in the world, to any buyer, at any time. Today, we are going inside the infrastructure that holds more geopolitical power than most people realize, and explaining exactly how it works. To understand why LNG terminals matter, you first need to understand what LNG actually is and why it requires such extraordinary infrastructure to handle. LNG stands for liquefied natural gas. It is natural gas, the same methane that heats homes and powers gas turbines, that has been cooled to minus 162 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, natural gas contracts to approximately 1/600th of its original volume, a volume of gas that would fill 600 large rooms, becomes small enough to fit in one. This matters because of a fundamental problem with natural gas. Unlike oil, it cannot simply be pumped into a tanker ship and transported across the ocean. Gas at normal temperatures and pressures requires enormous volumes of space, making it impractical to ship long distances in its natural state. The solution, cooling it to a liquid, makes it dense enough to load onto specialized ships and transport anywhere in the world. But it requires 2 enormously complex pieces of infrastructure to make this possible. At the export end, you need a liquefaction terminal, a facility that takes natural gas from a pipeline, removes impurities, cools it to minus 162 degrees, and loads it into a specially insulated tanker ship. At the import end, you need a regasification terminal, a facility that receives the liquid, warms it back into gas, and feeds it into the local pipeline network. Between these 2 terminals sits one of the most sophisticated vessels ever built, an LNG carrier, a ship that maintains its cargo at cryogenic temperatures for weeks at sea, using the same principles as a giant vacuum flask, while carrying enough energy to power a mid-sized city for months. The combination of these 3 elements, liquefaction, carrier, regasification, is what makes global gas trade possible, and it is why LNG terminals are among the most expensive, most strategically significant, and most difficult to build pieces of infrastructure on Earth. A liquefaction terminal is one of the most complex industrial facilities ever built. Understanding how it works explains why so few countries can actually build one, and why those that have them hold so much power. The process begins with gas arriving by pipeline from the producing field. In Qatar, gas from the North Field, which we covered in our last video, travels by pipeline to the Laffan industrial city, home to the largest concentration of LNG liquefaction capacity in the world. The gas first passes through a treatment plant that removes water, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, and heavy hydrocarbons. These impurities would freeze solid at cryogenic temperatures and destroy the equipment. The clean gas then enters what is called a processing train. This is the heart of the facility, a series of refrigeration cycles that progressively cool the gas, first using propane, then a mixture of ethane and methane, bringing the temperature down in stages until it reaches -162 degrees Celsius and becomes liquid. A single processing train can liquefy approximately 7 to 8 million tons of LNG per year. Qatar currently operates 14 trains at Ras Laffan and is building 6 more as part of the North Field expansion. The liquid LNG is then stored in enormous insulated tanks, some over 80 meters in diameter, before being transferred through cryogenic loading arms directly into the LNG carrier ship docked alongside. The entire process from gas arrival to ship departure runs continuously, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. A single, large liquefaction terminal can load one LNG carrier every 2 to 3 days. Building a facility like this costs between $10 and $20 billion. It takes 5 to 7 years to construct, and it requires a workforce of thousands just to operate. This is why only a handful of countries in the world have them, and why those countries have leverage that extends far beyond their borders. At the other end of the journey sits the Regasification terminal, the gateway through which LNG enters a country's energy system. The LNG carrier docks at the terminal and connects to cryogenic unloading arms. The liquid is transferred into insulated storage tanks, identical in design to those at the export terminal. From storage, the liquid LNG passes through a regasification unit, a heat exchanger that warms it back to gas using seawater, air, or steam. As the temperature rises past -162 degrees, the liquid expands back into gas, 600 times its liquid volume, and enters the pipeline network at the pressure required for distribution. The entire process from ship arrival to gas entering the pipeline takes approximately 12 to 24 hours. What changed the world's ability to build regasification capacity quickly is a technology called a floating storage and regasification unit, an FSRU. Unlike a land-based terminal, which requires years of construction, an FSRU is a ship that combines LNG storage and regasification in a single floating vessel. It can be moored offshore, connected to an undersea pipeline, and made operational within months of ordering. It was FSRUs that allowed Germany to commission 5 LNG import terminals in under a year after the Russian gas crisis of 2022. Countries that previously had no LNG infrastructure could suddenly access global gas supplies within months, not decades. This technology has fundamentally changed the geopolitics of energy. The ability to receive LNG is no longer limited to countries with the time and money to build billion-dollar land facilities. It is now accessible to almost any coastal nation willing to lease an FSRU. Look at a map of global LNG flows, and you begin to understand immediately where the power lies. On the export side, the countries that liquefy and sell gas, the landscape is dominated by 4 players. Qatar is the second largest LNG exporter in the world, with plans to become the largest within this decade through the North Field expansion. Its location at the center of shipping routes between Europe and Asia gives it unmatched flexibility to redirect cargoes to wherever prices are highest. Australia is currently the world's largest LNG exporter, with massive production facilities in Western Australia and Queensland, supplying primarily to Japan, South Korea, and China. The United States became a major LNG exporter from 2016 onward, as the shale gas revolution created such enormous domestic surplus that liquefaction terminals on the Gulf Coast became commercially attractive. American LNG now reaches over 40 countries. Russia, through its Arctic LNG projects, was growing rapidly as an exporter until international sanctions following the Ukraine invasion severely disrupted its expansion plans. On the import side, the picture is more complex. Japan and South Korea have been the world's largest LNG importers for decades. Both countries have no domestic gas production and rely almost entirely on LNG for their gas needs. China has rapidly become the world's largest LNG importer. As its growing economy demands more gas and domestic production cannot keep pace, and Europe, historically reliant on Russian pipeline gas, has undergone the fastest transformation in LNG import capacity in history, adding more regasification capacity between 2022 and 2024 than in the previous 20 years combined. The result is a global gas market that is now genuinely interconnected in a way it never was before. A supply disruption in one region, a price spike in another, a cold winter in Asia. All of these events now ripple through LNG markets globally, affecting buyers and sellers on every continent. Here is the geopolitical reality that the LNG terminal map reveals. When a country controls a major liquefaction terminal, it does not just sell gas. It sells security. It sells reliability. It sells the ability to keep hospitals warm, factories running, and populations fed in a crisis. Qatar demonstrated this perfectly in 2022. As European governments scrambled for alternatives to Russian gas, Qatar was one of the first calls made by European energy ministers. The conversations that followed were not just commercial. They involved long-term strategic relationships, political agreements, and defense cooperation discussions. Gas became a diplomatic currency. The United States used LNG in a similar way. American LNG exports to Europe increased by over 140% in the year following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this was not purely commercial. It was a deliberate strategic decision by the US government to use energy exports to strengthen transatlantic alliances and reduce European dependence on an adversary. But the power of LNG terminals also creates vulnerability for the countries that import it. Japan has no domestic gas production. Its entire industrial economy depends on LNG arriving by ship. A disruption to shipping routes through the South China Sea, through which much of its LNG travels, would be an economic emergency within weeks. Japan's foreign policy, defense spending, and diplomatic relationships are all shaped in part by this single vulnerability. Europe learned the same lesson the hard way in 2022. The speed with which Russian gas was weaponized against European economies shocked governments that had assumed commercial relationships were insulated from geopolitics. The countries that are now building LNG import infrastructure the fastest are not just making energy decisions, they are making national security decisions, and the countries that control the export terminals, Qatar, the United States, Australia, understand that their gas is not just a commodity, it is leverage. The LNG investment wave currently underway is the largest in the industry's history. Qatar's North Field expansion, which we covered in our previous video, will add 6 new liquefaction trains to Ras Laffan by the end of this decade, making Qatar capable of producing 142 million tons of LNG per year. To put that in context, the entire world traded approximately 400 million tons of LNG in 2023. Qatar alone will account for over a third of that. In the United States, multiple new liquefaction projects along the Gulf Coast are in various stages of construction and approval. Analysts estimate US LNG export capacity could double by 2030. The UAE, through ADNOC, is expanding its LNG operations on Das Island, which we covered in our very first video. Das Island has been exporting LNG since 1977, making it one of the longest-running LNG operations in the world. Its expansion is part of ADNOC's broader strategy to maximize the value of UAE gas resources before global demand peaks. In South Korean shipyards, hundreds of new LNG carriers are under construction, each one costing approximately $250 million and taking 2 years to build. The global LNG fleet is expanding at a pace not seen since the industry began. And on the import side, countries from Germany to Vietnam to Bangladesh to Pakistan are commissioning new regasification terminals, connecting themselves to global gas markets for the first time. The infrastructure being built today will shape the world's energy map for the next 30 to 40 years. The decisions being made in engineering offices and government ministries right now will determine which countries have energy security and which ones remain vulnerable for decades to come. The next time you see one of those enormous white tanker ships in a port or at sea, the ones with the distinctive domed tanks on their deck, you are looking at one of the most strategically important vessels on Earth. Inside those tanks, at minus 162 degrees, is the energy that heats homes, powers factories, and keeps economies running across 3 continents. The terminals that load and unload those ships are not just industrial facilities, they are the nodes through which global energy power flows. And the countries that control the most of them are quietly holding one of the most valuable cards in 21st century geopolitics. Subscribe to Oil and Gas Explained for more videos like this. Next week, we are answering a question we get asked constantly. How does oil actually get from a well under the ocean floor all the way to your fuel tank? The full journey, step by step. See you then.